in that place where people died and were tortured, you have plaques that acknowledge what happened, that clearly states the responsibility of the Chilean government, the Chilean state, in those disappearances. And those survivor groups, they also managed to get official commemorations to take place there every year. And every year you also have public lectures, presentations from historians, from other academics of what happened, and again demonstrating the Chilean state's responsibility. But it's not the state who decided on its own to create that kind of memorial. Again, it's civil society who fought hard and strong for it. So that's how you look at the past. You acknowledge your responsibility, and you create a place that responds to the need and the priorities of people, of survivors especially. But it's a bit different, obviously, from Ukraine, because it was a national context, okay? There was no other foreign occupying power involved in Chile. I don't think I will have time to cover all of these examples in details, but I'll try to talk about the most important things. So maybe we can take a look at the situation in Namibia now. So for those of you who may not know, in Namibia, you had one of the first genocides recognized by history. It happened at the start of the 20th century, and it was perpetrated by German settlers in Namibia against Nama and Herero ethnic groups. So again, thousands died, thousands were illegally detained and forced to work in detention centers in Namibia, just because they were asking for more liberties against the German settlers in their own land. As soon as the independence of Namibia, the state actually has undertaken policy memories. As soon as it gained independence from Germany, they started building museums, memorials, statues about this genocide. But what they did is that they focused on heroic male figures of resistance to the genocide. So you had museums who only talked about male combatants against German settlers. You only had statues of heroic male figures. And that eclipsed part of the reality of that genocide. Because we know now from research, from, I would even say like militant research, we now know that men were not the only resistors. They were not the prime victim of the genocide, contrary to what was proclaimed by the state of Namibia. We now know from research and from efforts of civil society that actually women and children were the main victims of detention centers and forced labor camps. They were disproportionately represented there. We also know from research that it's elderly women who encourage men to take up arms and fight the settlers. But that was not recognized by the state in official policies, in official archiving, in official museums. It took almost a century, well, at least 70 years, for, again, women's rights association, individual women academics to uncover the truth and share that. And in that process of uncovering the truth, they built very strong women's rights organization. And again, empowering them, finding resilience, finding resources to address the state and force it to recognize the whole truth, not just part of the history of Namibia, but the entire stories of people who lived that genocide. And we also know from research, again, that eclipsing part of that reality of genocide and the impact it had on women and children, it led to intergenerational trauma. Because the state was not recognizing what happened to you as a woman detained in forced labor camp, who did not recognize what happened to your children being slaughtered by German settlers. That has dire consequences on your mental health for decades. And you end on passing that to your children and future generations. So in that example of the Namibia Nama genocide, you get both an example of what kind of inclusive memory could be, and the contrary example of what it leads to when you are not doing inclusive memory work. And that fight for recognition, it's actually still ongoing. Those women's organizations, they're still fighting for their stories, their ancestor stories to be included in official museums in Namibia. And there is also a process between Germany and Namibia for recognizing that genocide, for getting reparations for the harm that German settlers caused on Namibia. And those women, again, are fighting to have their stories recorded, recognized, and told, and obviously be provided reparations in their own rights. My final example of the international experience before we actually look at what is being done in Ukraine, it's about the War Childhood Museum. You might know this organization because they're very active in Ukraine at the moment. But the project actually started in Sarajevo after the Bosnia-Herzegovina war, the war on Bosnia-Herzegovina, I would say. So this project, it's actually for me the epitome of how you do inclusive and participatory approach to memory work. It actually started as a book project. It was one of those, a man who was himself a child while the war was ongoing in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And he launched a call to his peers, to other people in Bosnia who had been children as the war was happening, to contribute to his book, to tell their stories as children living under the war. And what began as a book project actually became a museum. Because those former children were saying a book is not enough to tell our stories. We need more space, a more appropriate space. And now this has become a museum in Sarajevo. They've collected hundreds of artifacts from children, or from people who were children at the time. So they collectively agreed to create that museum. They've launched a wide call in Bosnia and to the diaspora abroad to send artifacts. That includes, for example, your toys as you were a child growing up in war-affected Bosnia, diaries, tickets for a concert, etc., etc. Everything that makes a child's life at that time. So it showed also that as the war was unfolding, children were still being children. There were children being affected by war, but they also have their daily life. So that contributed to the history of the war on Bosnia. And that place, it's not just a museum that collects artifacts from the past. It's a real place of learning and of promoting memory work. So they are welcoming hundreds of children every year from Bosnia and from abroad. And they are implementing child-sensitive memory activities. So children can engage, today's children can engage with the memory of the Bosnia war. And they are also very big on promoting child-sensitive approaches to memory work. So on their website, in different languages, including English, they are actually sharing educational material for other organizations across the world to talk about the war with children, to talk about the impact of the war on children, but also with children as active audience of those memory projects. And on top of that, I would say ordinary exhibition, permanent exhibition. They also have temporary exhibitions, and the pictures shown here is part of one of those temporary exhibitions. It's part of the exhibition Speaking Out. And this was organized, I think, in 2021. And the museum actually launched a call for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, which was inflicted during the Bosnia War. And they invited all people who would like to join in this project. So they invited people to participate in art therapy. People who said yes to that project, they were how would you say that? They work with psychologists to address what happened to them. And through art therapy, they were able to tell their stories in their own world, in their own terms. They shared whatever they were comfortable with the support of psychologists. And in those artworks, you can see on the War Childhood Museum's website, they did body map, so they represented themselves. And above their body map, they put words that would reflect their past, what happened to them, but mostly what they would like to see for themselves in the future. So they were not only able to look at the past, but also look at the future. And that's all memory work should be about. It's about linking the past, the current situation, and the future. Not only to recognize past suffering, but also to promote, again, resilience and healing. So I'm sorry, it's not Croatia, but I hope these examples from abroad show how diverse and how human rights-centric memory work can be. So now talking about Ukraine. So obviously, Ukraine has a long-standing expertise in memory work, especially with how we can address World War II legacy, the Soviet legacy, how we uncover the truth about the Holodomor, etc., etc. It does not come from a vacuum again. And especially since 2014, there is a huge expertise in Ukraine on documenting war crimes, for example, and human rights violation. And this is actually part of memory work. What has happened, why it has happened, how it has happened, who is responsible for it. So again, this goes back to our assessment. People are saying now that we need to document what is happening. We need to document not only hard facts, the invasion started on that day, this is what happened on the 31st of March in that town, etc., but also about documenting narratives, people's stories. And if you do not start that now, some people will not be able to tell their stories in 2, 3, 10 years from now. And on the contrary, there are people who are not able today to share what happened to them. And that's completely okay. But maybe with a strong resilience and support network, they will be able to tell their stories in 10, 20 years from now. And so it's important to understand that memory work is a progressive thing, it's a living thing, it's not set in stone. Again, it's important to understand that individual stories, the story of one inhabitant from Kipti, for example, settlement, it's part of the global history of the community and of Ukraine in general. And we'll see, again, looking at Association for Democratic Development, Northern Cultural Projects, how you fit these individual stories into a bigger collective memory project. So yes, from 2014, there are multiple projects about the current war, and it's beginning in the East. So you have museum, you have temporary exhibitions, you have war crime documentation projects, you have the collection of fallen soldier portraits, streets being renamed, dialogue circles for conflict-related sexual violence survivors. All of these are instruments of memory work. So you can see how diverse, how flexible it is, and how you can adapt memory work to your community's needs and priorities. So, sorry.
Дружина загинула,
Can we cut the video? It
а
was
мені
not
Бога ставив.
intended.
Хлопець воює, син. Дружина загинула, а мені...
Thank you. Sorry for the IT difficulties. So some of my colleagues from Association for Democratic Development are here in the room with us today. And it's a project, a very strong memory project that is being undertaken in Чернігові region. And I think it's a great example of how inclusive again and how participatory your memory projects can be to promote social cohesion, to promote resilience, healing in your communities. So what was Association for Democratic Development idea? they proposed a very, very comprehensive memory work project. So they wanted to honor those who have fallen victim of the conflict, but they also wanted to talk about the living and think of them and support them. So they are creating memorials in 3 different localities: Kipti, Koluchivka, and Kinka, if I'm not mistaken. They are building physical memorials, and they've built maple alley tree commemorating those who lost their lives. But how did they do that? They actually consulted their communities. They've launched surveys online and offline with the cooperation of local authorities to make sure that all those who live in these communities had a say on how these memorials were done, what they should look like, where they should be located. And so now you can actually watch the video on YouTube where they built those maple tree alley. And it's actually really interesting to see how they try to fit commemorating, honoring those who died, with creating spaces for public life to also recover in those 3 settlements. So they made sure that people, families, mothers with children could actually access this place. And some of them are close, for example, to sports areas for children. So children have a place to engage in public life, in public spaces, and at the same time they are able to access this piece of history of their community. What they also did to ensure that everyone was able to engage in memory work, because obviously the war is still happening, is still ongoing, so people may have different priorities than looking at the past. They may be too traumatized to talk about what happened, to want to engage with that kind of things. So they also conducted art therapy sessions for women and girls from the community. So they have a safe space to address what happened to them. They feel empowered enough to regain access to public life and to participate in these projects. They also organize public lectures for children, etc. They're also conducting therapy sessions for community members, again, who feel the need to talk with someone else. And in the long run, they are using memory work to promote social cohesion, social life in their 3 communities. And to do so, they are working closely with local authorities, because yes, it's a civil society organization, but they also need to cooperate with local authorities to create those spaces. So I thought it was a very strong example of how you do memory work in a way that is inclusive, that is rooted in your community members' needs and priorities. You are not just imposing one project on them, you're actually asking them what they want, how it should look like, where it should be located. And my colleague from ADD, I think, will be glad to talk with you about that project during breaks and the rest of the day. Another example from the Чернігові region on memory work, it's a project of Northern Cultural Capital. So it's an oral history project. Northern Cultural Capital has been working in Чернігові region for years now. They have already published a whole history book. And now they're publishing a second one. So they are interested in extending the scientific knowledge, the scientific space of oral history in Ukraine, but they're also obviously interested in documenting stories from Чернігові region and giving people a chance to tell what happened to them, to have these stories shared across Ukraine and also abroad, because the book will be translated into English. So again, Northern Cultural Capital has cooperated with local authorities, local community leaders, to identify people who would be willing to take part in that project. Some local community leaders also encourage them to maybe look at different topics that they were not first looking into. And they're also working with regional archiving systems, if I'm not mistaken, to have that part of official history of the oblasts. So as part of the Northern Cultural Capital, 22 new stories will be added to their collection to tell the story of Чернігів residents. And as I said, these stories will not just be promoted in Чернігові, but there'll also be a way to tell the story of Чернігові region since 2022 and before to people in different parts of Ukraine. Because as we said at the beginning, your experience of the war is not the same as someone who lives in Dnipro, someone who lives in Kharkiv, someone who lives in Lviv. So it's important to promote this mutual understanding of what happened in the winter of 2022, for example, what is happening now. And again, we also think, and Northern Cultural Capital also think that memory work is also very important for an international audience. Again, to establish Russia's responsibility for what is happening, to fight Russian disinformation, because we know that it's a phenomenon, that Russia is trying to tell the world that no, they're not responsible, you know, all their narrative about the war and its reasons. So memory work can also be a tool in fighting that disinformation, in fueling international support for Ukraine, and have this official history recognized and remembered. This is the reality. This is our lived realities. This is what Russia is doing to us and how it is doing to us. So with those words, I'll just leave you with a couple of questions. I hope this presentation will help you address them. But this is something I would like us to always think of when we are doing memory work, is how can memory be a pathway towards survivor and community healing? What are the roles that public institutions can have in promoting that forms of inclusive participatory memory projects? How policies we adopt, practices we implement can support and expand grassroots projects? How can civil society and the states and local authorities and community leaders can collaborate to promote, again, this inclusive and participatory approach, to make sure that people have a say in how we remember them, what we remember, and how the Ukrainian history will look like in 10 years from now. So I will end with this and leave the floor to my colleague Anton. I will be more than happy to take your questions maybe during the last session of the day, so we're not too late with our agenda. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Всім добрий день. Я, з вашого дозволу, буду стояти, бо я не можу розповідати сидячи. Я препад, і тому мені дуже складно щось говорити і сидіти при цьому, і це одна з моїх найбільших проблем. Я дякую за запрошення. Для мене честь, направду, бути тут, незважаючи на те, що я сьогодні прокинувся о 4:45 ранку, і я дуже хочу спати, але те, про що ми будемо говорити, більш важливе, ніж мій сон. І я дуже дякую громадам і активістам, які займаються питанням пам'яті, направду навколо яких рве все з усіх сторін. І мене запросили поговорити з вами про якраз сенситивні питання меморіалізації української війни, і завжди такі розповіді я починаю з однієї військової метафори, якщо серйозно казати про політику меморіалізації в Україні сьогодні. то і про пам'ять російсько-української війни, то за великим рахунком це як ходіння по мінному полю. Ну, тобто один неправильний крок і можна підірватися, бо це дуже конфліктна історія. Меморіалізація цієї війни вже, очевидно, відбувається з певними проблемами, певним розривом, який я вам хочу показати. Також там заложено деякі конфліктогенні ситуації. Ми вже зараз бачимо такі певні, як це сказати правильно і коректно, певні вимоги або заклики до справедливості, бо хтось вбачає в якихось комеморативних чи меморативних практиках, в тому числі навколо загиблих військових, несправедливість, бо тут навколо виникає купа питань, кого героїзувати, кого не героїзувати, хто обирає тих, кого ми героїзуємо. Я сьогодні здебільшого буду говорити про голоси маргіналізованих спільнот, тобто це людей, персон, груп, маленьких громад, в кого або відбирають голос, або кому голос не надають, що також є великою проблемою. Ну, тобто є певна ієрархізація і очевидна штука, в якій ми з вами перебуваємо, це певний дисбаланс, в якому нам точно варто шукати діалог, і ми це робимо. Я дуже дякую Інституту пам'яті, який намагається робити, на мій погляд, дуже важливі речі в дуже складній ситуації при мінімальному фінансуванні, тобто в порівнянні з, і це означає, що є спроба шукати діалог між державою і спільнотами, але його шукати дуже складно, і про це я також буду зараз, незважаючи на те, що камера, я навіть питав, чи нас будуть записувати, мені доведеться говорити не дуже солодкі речі, і це за великим рахунком моя задача. І хотів би я почати з відомої Сюзан Зонтаг. Сюзан Зонтаг – це американська філософикиня, журналістка, культурологиня, яка написала багато робіт і була на війнах, в тому числі і у В'єтнамі, і після чого вона зробила прекрасну книжку про фотографії війни, яка називається «Як дивитися на страждання інших», де вона спробувала подумати над тим, що ми бачимо, коли ми дивимося просто на фотознімки війни, трагедії, жертв, чи може це в нас викликати якісь емоції, як ми це можемо інтерпретувати, чи ми це інтелектуалізуємо, чи щось з цим робимо. І коли вона коли вона писала цю книгу в своєму щоденнику, вона написала, що я весь час в пошуку мови, бо мені весь час дуже складно говорити про війну. І вона дослівно пише, якщо існує хоч якась тактовність в таких болісних мареннях, тобто певних уявах і думаннях про війну, я шукатиму її. І це моя перша позиція. Мені завжди дуже важко говорити про війну через те, що в мене купа друзів і близьких на фронті, через те, що для мене війна почалася в 2014 році, бо я з Донецька. І в 14-му я двічі внутрішньо переселена особа, я двічі евакуйовував батьків, і тому для мене це особливе важливе значення. І навіть коли здавалося, що Україна в ширшому розумінні цього слова, не дивиться на події там з 14-го до 22-го на Сході, як на реальну велику війну. Я навіть пам'ятаю себе в 2016-му, я виступав на великій конференції в Відні і казав, що Путін точно хоче захопити всю Україну і точно буде велика війна, на що мені високочолі такі, знаєте, люди в Відні казали, що я просто маю травмований донецький досвід і, значить, не люблю русню, і вони не такі погані, і все буде добре. А виявилося, що все-таки хороший русський, мертвий русський, ну то інша історія. Да? І отже, про сенситивні питання і про тему, я знову комп клацаю, про тему, про яку я маю говорити. Один з дослідників політики пам'яті або такого поняття, як соціальна, культурна, історична пам'ять, Конфіно, спостерігаючи за тим, як в західному світі, як в західній академії відбуваються різні способи політики меморіалізації. Тут сьогодні згадували Балкани, ми можемо говорити про Committee of Truth and Reconciliation, про комісії примирення і правди. Ми можемо говорити про приклади внутрішніх політик типу Камбоджі. Сьогодні колежанка навела прекрасні приклади з Латинської Америки, які є дуже важливими для нас. Але, повірте, направду, Для мене ми з вами знаходимося в точці 0, і зараз я буду це пояснювати. Ми можемо брати і маємо використовувати ці досвіди, вони реально для нас можуть бути корисними з точки зору пошуку діалогів, з точки зору інклюзивності, з точки зору залученості